Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
The United States imprisons more people than any other country in the world, and Black people bear the burdens of mass incarceration the most. In 2019, Connecticut was one of 7 states where Black people were incarcerated at over 9 times the rate of white people. That's according to an analysis done by the Sentencing Project. In recent years, there have been lots of calls to address racial injustice in the U.S. criminal justice system. But what does real change look like? From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Today we take a look at the criminal justice system in the United States with James Forman Jr. He's the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale University. His book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America, won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018. Earlier this year, Professor Forman co-edited a new book. It's called Dismantling Mass Incarceration, a Handbook for Change. The book discusses the problems in the system and points us toward solutions. Professor, welcome to Disrupted.
It's great to be here.
You have a distinguished career as an author, as an educator, as a lawyer, and it doesn't feel like a job. It feels like you feel called to do this really different and difficult work. What's that calling that you feel to do this?
For me, I think it really came from my parents and my family. You know, my parents met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were civil rights workers in the 1960s. And they were part of a generation that just changed and transformed this nation in ways that, we still have to be grateful to them for that. They're an interracial couple. My dad is Black, my mom is white, and they met at a time when those marriages were illegal in many states in America. And so being a descendant of them in particular and of that generation, to me, has always motivated me. It's always inspired me. I look at what they did and what others like them did, regular people who felt that calling that you just described, who marched and protested and voted and did things that almost feel superhuman now when we look back at, and we watch the films and we read the history books. So to me, anything that I do now feels easy compared to that.
You are someone who was literally born out of resistance to limiting norms and laws, resistance to this idea that people cannot chart their own American dream. And yet, James, sometimes when I talk to young people, they think those are the battles of the 60s and the 70s. Look at these things that we have, the access we have. We have now moved past that. But your work is really seeing the work of dismantling mass incarceration, attacking the system as the natural next step in a broader civil rights movement. How do you see that for someone of your age and your generation as having reverence for the work of your parents and others, but also saying the struggle continues and I want to answer that call?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think about why I went to law school, right? I went to law school right here in New Haven at Yale. And when I went, the one thing I knew is I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. I didn't know what that meant. If you had pressed me, I would have gotten a little bit fuzzy. But I knew the role that lawyers had played in the civil rights movement. Of course, I knew about Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and Constance Baker Motley. And so I was inspired by them. But I didn't really know exactly what that meant for my generation. And so for me, when I was graduating law school in the 1990s, what I looked at as the area where actually for Black people things were getting worse was in the criminal justice or the criminal legal system. The United States passed Russia and South Africa to become the world's largest jailer in the 1980s. We weren't always. In the early 1990s, the Sentencing Project issued its first report saying that for 1 in 4 young Black men is under criminal justice supervision. And so these are numbers and data points and realities that I was becoming aware of as I was graduating from law school. So when I looked out at the world and I asked myself, well, what could I do that is consistent with the mission that my parents' generation laid down? At least for me, it wasn't the same issues as they were working on, but it was an outgrowth of those same issues. And so for me, that's why I felt called to become a public defender and to be in the trenches, in the front lines, kind of putting my body next to my clients and saying, I am going to stand in the way of this system. I am going to fight this system that is being so brutal and so harsh towards people that I care about the only way that I know how, which is to go into court and to represent and to vigorously and with passion and commitment and love fight.
Being a public defender is a very difficult job. You are working with people who often feel overlooked, who are overlooked. Public defenders' caseloads are often overwhelming and unsustainable. Public defender offices are often under-resourced, purposely so, dare I say. Mm-hmm. But as you said, you are putting your body, you are putting your heart, you're putting your soul on the line to say, people deserve access to justice, and they deserve to have people who have respect for them and not just disdain for whatever situation they find themselves in. How did being a public defender speak to this is one entry point into the system, into the process, but I also recognize there's so much more to this. Talk to us a little bit about your time as a public defender.
The thing that I think is often overlooked about being a public defender, I had a friend who used to tell this story. She was one of my colleagues at the office, and it has always resonated with me. And, she would say, the thing about being a public defender is it actually puts you in the institutional, like the professional position of believing in the possibility of your fellow human being. And what I mean by that is take a typical sentencing hearing. So somebody has gone to trial or pled guilty and they're now facing sentencing, right? And let's say they have one prior drug conviction and now this is their second one. But at the same time, they have a history of addiction, they have a family that cares about them, they have children that they want to be there for. So they're telling you before sentencing, listen, Forman, see what you can do to get me into this drug treatment program. If I get into it, I'm really going to succeed in the program this time and be able to be there for my family. Okay, so you argue for that at sentencing. Now, the prosecutor argues too often, for the opposite of that. They say, no, listen, judge, don't believe this defendant when they say that this time they're going to turn their life around because they already had that prior conviction. They got their chance. So the only thing that you can do now, judge, is lock them up. But see, the public defender position is the belief that my client today, this time, is actually going to achieve their goals if given that opportunity. So what I think about being a public defender that people just don't talk about enough is how fundamentally hopeful a job it is, because you have to believe in the capacity of your client, of your fellow human being, to overcome obstacles that they may never have overcome before, but this time, today, they're going to do it. And I loved having that job. I loved having a job that called me to believe in my fellow human being.
There is a passion that I hear in your voice. There's a possibility that I hear in your voice. And I don't want us to underestimate the power of that, particularly in these moments where sometimes the problem seems so big and seems so interconnected that we wonder, is change possible? And to hear you talk about, yes, I get to see people who make change in their lives, who realize I want better for myself and for my children. And all I need is maybe one more chance, one more opportunity to see that possibility to move forward in my life. Is there an example or a case, a client that comes to mind when you think about this was a situation where I was reminded of that human possibility and it helped me say, yes, this is what we need to do to move forward?
Absolutely. There's so many, to be honest. But one of the ones that I write about in my book, and I don't identify anybody by actual name, right? But let's just call this person Jason for purposes of this conversation. He was a juvenile client, and he had gone up to rob a man at a bus stop, and he had gotten a few dollars from the guy, all the money that the guy had, and he had run away. A security guard at the store across the street had seen it and had chased him and had caught him. So he's caught a couple blocks away. He has the money in his pocket, the same amount that the guy said was taken from him. The police officer drive the guy who was robbed down, and he identifies my client. So he's guilty, right? This is not the innocent person got caught, which there are cases like that for sure, but this just was not one of them. From the beginning, my client was incredibly apologetic. He even actually apologized to the detective, and the detective, to his credit, put the apology in the statement, in the witness statement. So it was documented that even on that night, my client was sorry for what he had done. To make a long story short, we eventually got to the sentencing hearing. And in that intervening time, I had a chance to talk to the man who was robbed, Mr. Thomas. And I had told him the rest of my client's life story, which included the fact that he had a sibling who had been incarcerated. He was trying to avoid getting into that life, but he had gotten incredible pressure from other older kids in the neighborhood. And they basically had told him, we'll be your family, but you have to participate in this robbery. And it was his initiation, which is one of the reasons why he was so bad at it. Mm-hmm. He goes to the sentencing, and the man who was robbed actually speaks and says that he does not think that he should be locked up. And the judge in that case put my client into a job training program that was run actually out of a church basement by a local pastor who really was committed to helping kids. That happened. He got probation. He got into the job program, and I lost track of Jason. Years later, I was in Washington, D.C. I was walking down by the metro, and I had to cross the street because there was construction going on. And I was walking by the construction site, and somebody shouted down, "Mr. Forman." And I didn't know who it was because it had been some years. And he came down, and he was buff. He was, he had grown up. He wasn't 16 anymore, but it was Jason. And that was the last time that he ever got arrested, and he cites that job training program that the judge put him into as what really helped him on what was a long pathway, but eventually that led him to this job as a construction worker. And now he had a child of his own, and he was committed. He told me, I am committed to making sure that my child does not make the mistakes that I made when I was a teenager. And one of the things that I think is unfortunate about our criminal system is that the people in the system, the judges, the prosecutors, the probation officers, even the defense lawyers like me, we don't normally get to see those stories. Because think about it. If you work in the system, the people that you see are the people who get rearrested. Mm-hmm. And that breeds a kind of cynicism, right? We don't see all the people who take that opportunity that they get if they're given an opportunity, and they go on and make new and different lives for themselves. But I got a chance to see it that day outside the metro, and it has always stuck in my mind as an example of what the system could be, but too often isn't.
I want to point something out that I think is important. I hear you say criminal system. Most people say criminal justice system, and that's intentional. And I think it represents so much of your belief about this system that has been created and the systems that feed into that. Why use the phrase criminal system, not criminal justice?
It's funny that you should ask that, because I used to use the term criminal justice system. If you had talked to me in the 90s or in the 2000s, I would have used that term. That's the standard term. And then In 2017, Locking Up Our Own came out, and I was doing book tours, all around the country. And one of the places I went to was San Quentin. And San Quentin was a state prison in California. A lot of people know it now because the podcast Ear Hustle is produced there. And there were about 70 or 80 guys there in the audience. And I gave my kind of traditional book talk, and then we had breakout groups. And one of the breakout groups, one of the guys there said, Professor, I appreciate what you had to say, but you kept talking about the criminal justice system. And I don't think a system that delivers so little justice should have justice in its title. Like, I don't think we should bless it with that term because it's not delivering that. And that was that was in a lot of ways, it was a wake-up call for me. And I've grappled with it since because, of course, the tension is that we want it to be a justice system. So I sometimes still use the term in the aspirational sense, right, of what it could be. But when I actually talk about what it is, I do more often now use the term criminal system or criminal legal system because I think that the guy that I was talking to was right.
Coming up, more with Yale law professor James Forman Jr. He'll explain why he thinks practices like solitary confinement make everyone less safe. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're taking a look at the U.S. criminal justice system and some of the possible ways to change it. We're joined by Yale law professor and Pulitzer Prize-winning author James Forman Jr. He's co-editor of a new book called Dismantling Mass Incarceration, a Handbook for Change. There's a lot of disagreement about what it could mean to dismantle mass incarceration. So I asked Professor Forman about the perspective that he and his co-editors offer in this latest book.
Our intention in putting the book together was really to have a response to all the people who come up to me and my co-authors at talks that we give where we talk about how terrible the system is. As so many people, their first question is, well, what can we do to fix it? How can we change it? How can we make it less bad? So I really wanted, and Premal Daria and Maria Huilo, my co-authors, and I, we really wanted to try to pull together all the best writing that we could find on this topic. And the important thing for us, the first thing that we needed to do was to break the system up into its component parts, because the average person, even if they understand the term mass incarceration, the United States locks up more people than any other country in the world, they're not really sure how that happens. And so we read thousands of articles to try to find what are the most interesting and provocative ideas of somebody coming up with a solution, coming up with a proposal for how you can make that part of the system better. Because there's no czar over the whole thing, right? There's no one person that controls all of these aspects. So if we're going to make a change, we're probably going to have to make a change at the level of changing how the police operate in our community, changing how the prosecutors operate, changing how the public defenders are funded, changing how the judges operate. And so that's the way that the book is organized. And the last thing I'll say about it is we very intentionally wrote it so that the average person who's interested in this topic could pick it up. And when they put it down, they'll have some ideas that they could act on. They're probably not going to want to be, they're not going to be persuaded by everything in the book. We don't want that, but they're going to be persuaded by something. And that something they can take and ideally in community can move to create change and create action.
One of the choices that is often made in the United States is around solitary confinement. And I really appreciated how the handbook brought that into the discussion of those long-term consequences, not just when people are in prison, but the harms and traumas that stay with them for the rest of their lives. Talk to our listeners about that practice and how you see it fitting into this broader system that you discuss in the book.
Solitary confinement is inhumane. The Supreme Court and many international bodies have analogized it to torture. And it's a practice that has been reduced. So there's been a lot of effective advocacy. And one thing that I do want to say that I think is important just to note in this conversation is that in each of these areas that we're talking about, there are people who are fighting and in many cases winning change, right? So this is both a story of oppression and of resistance, often effective resistance to that oppression. And the movement to end solitary confinement is a very, very good example of that. So the number of people that are held in solitary or held in isolation has declined significantly over the past 10 years, but it's only declined because people have demanded it, right? And it hasn't declined fast enough. It's still much too common, including right here in Connecticut. I think when we think about solitary confinement, in a lot of ways, it raises the broader question of kind of prison conditions and conditions of confinement generally. Because when I talk to people about prisons, there's people who will say, well, and I agree with this for some people. I tend to think it's a much smaller number than a lot of other people would say. But there are some people who at this moment present such a risk to society and sometimes to themselves that they need to be contained in some way. They can't just be out and about. But that is just the beginning of the conversation, right? Because then the next conversation is, okay, well, contained in what way? Held in what conditions? What are the opportunities for human flourishing? What are the opportunities for developing your education, for learning job skills, for getting the treatment for trauma, which the research is overwhelming in terms of 50, 60, 70% of people in prison having experienced? What are the opportunities for drug treatment and mental health treatment? So we could create institutions where people were held from the rest of society for a period of time, either for some sort of punishment or because they are a threat. But those places don't have to look like the prisons of today. And there are other countries around the world that have leaps and bounds beyond the United States in terms of creating prisons where people actually have the opportunity to live a close to normal life. But when I say close to normal, I actually probably want to even back off from that, because this is a point that I want to make. Being confined is itself the punishment. Like being not allowed to leave a place, to me, that's the punishment. The problem that we have in this country is we've decided that on top of that, we need to build institutions that are themselves punishing. We need to build institutions that are degrading. And what I want to say to people is no. Your punishment is the very fact that you cannot leave this place for some period of time. We would all experience that as punishment. If you told me or you or anybody in this audience, you now have to go live in this place away from your family, you cannot leave for a period of time, we would all say that's horrible, right? And so to me, the point that I'm trying to make in the book, in a lot of ways that some of the excerpts are trying to make, is that's punishment enough. We don't need to do extra things like put you in a hole for 23 hours a day where you have no human contact and somebody is sliding a sandwich through a tiny little slot, and that's all you get to eat for 8 hours, for 12 hours. Those sorts of things that we do now are brutal, degrading, they're unnecessary. And here, in some ways, is the worst part about it. They make us all less safe because 98% of people who go to prison are coming home. So why would we want to brutalize people and then have them come back into our community? Because we know what hurt people do. They hurt other people. So why would we hurt people in the prison system only to have them hurt us and hurt themselves and hurt their family when they get released?
What do you say to people who say, yes, we should be tougher? Someone who has committed a harm shouldn't be better off, however people define that, than someone who is not, or someone who has suffered. What do you say in response?
I don't think anybody's going to be better off having gone through a criminal process, including the one that I'm imagining. I just don't think that makes you better off. I don't think we're talking about creating a world where people want, there's this myth that somehow people are going to want to commit a crime because what? No, I think that is a perspective of somebody who's never had a conversation with anybody who's ever gone through the criminal system. I mean, the very act of having to stand up in court and plead guilty and be called a criminal by a judge and by the law, right? That itself is degrading. So, in my mind, this is in a lot of ways almost a bigger question, because you said, one of the things you said that was so interesting is you said, well, why would somebody be, better off? And I guess what I want to say there is, to me, that raises a challenge about what kind of opportunities we provide to everybody. And so in my mind, I want to provide excellent housing and safe schools and and clean water to the entire community, such that everybody would have those things. So if you see someone getting something like that in prison, you're not thinking that, well, they got something that's better than what the rest of us got. We see this conversation that happens a lot with education in prison, right? I teach in prison. And sometimes people say, oh, you're a Yale professor and you're taking students from Quinnipiac and Yale, and they're all studying together with incarcerated students. Aren't those incarcerated students, by having an opportunity to be taking a college class with you, doesn't that then make them better off than somebody who's not even in prison? And I would say I'm working towards a world where everybody has access to higher education. So that question would never even come up. And then if they're not satisfied with that response, then I do think I come back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that we now have overwhelming evidence that if you are provided an opportunity to be educated in prison, you are then less likely to commit a crime when you get out, and you are more likely to get a job. And so since almost everyone is coming home, what I would say to that skeptical audience member is, all of these folks are coming home. They have now paid their debt to society. Don't we want to create an institution that is going to maximize the likelihood that when they come home, they will be able to be good parents, that they will be able to pay taxes, that they will be able to be solid members of the community making contributions, and that they will never, ever, ever have any motivation to commit a crime and go back to jail? Because if we do that, we will have made the neighborhood and the city and the country safer for all of us. So even if you don't do it because you're motivated by their well-being, do it because you're motivated by your own well-being.
That was Yale law professor James Forman Jr. In our conversation, Professor Forman spoke about prison education. And in my role as a professor at Wesleyan University, I work closely with the Center for Prison Education. For many years, the center has brought a liberal arts education to Connecticut prisons. Back in June of this year, I was honored to speak at a commencement ceremony for students in the program at Cheshire Correctional Institute. But today I want to remind you that you have persevered through a pandemic, through crippling self-doubt, through lockdowns and breakdowns, through fear and uncertainty. You have persevered, and now you are here. The ceremony at Cheshire included well-known speakers, including U.S. Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. But the ceremony wasn't about the big names or the well-known dignitaries. It was about the people who earned their degrees. Hear now the words of graduates David Haywood, Marco Macho Camacho, and Andrew Duke Dixon.
I was a young adult serving a nearly 8 decades long sentence, dwelling in a cell 21 and a half hours a day, feeling hopeless, angry, frustrated. What I needed was to feel like I could write my own life story.
Getting to this goal has taken dedication, focus, persistence, and sacrifice. Those words may be the same for a student in the dorms on Wesleyan's campus, but these words mean something different to us in prison cells.
There's a beauty in knowing the power of education, and that beauty is that once you have it, it can never be taken from you.
7 students in that commencement ceremony received their bachelor's in liberal studies from Wesleyan. 14 students received associate in science degrees from Connecticut State Community College, Middlesex. Coming up, James Forman Jr. discusses Vice President Harris's background as a prosecutor and shares what he would say if he were advising the campaign. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're discussing the U.S. criminal justice system and how it could be disrupted with Yale law professor James Forman Jr. He co-edited the new book, Dismantling Mass Incarceration, a Handbook for Change. One of the pieces in the book was written by the Washington Post editorial board. It's called, Whom Can We Call for Help? Police Should Not Always Be the Only Option. The piece explores whether police should always be the ones responding in situations where people are in crisis. Since 2015, about 20% of fatal police shootings have happened during a mental health crisis. That's according to data from the Washington Post. Because of that, some people worry about calling the police when a friend or a loved one or even a stranger is in crisis. Ask James what people should do when they need help, given the concerns they may have about calling 911.
So you asked, what should people do? And I guess I would just reframe the question slightly, which is, what should we do as a society? And then just very concretely, like, what should we do as a city? What should individual cities do? Because people are going to choose the options that are presented to them, right? We collectively have been trained since the late 1960s, early 1970s, which is when 911 was created, to call 911 for, almost everything. And there's been huge when 911 was introduced in the 1970s, there were big ad campaigns to persuade people to even call. People didn't know what 911 was. Those now have been, of course, completely effective, and it's all part of our, what it means to be in this country is to know that you call 911 in an emergency. When people envision 911, their vision is they're in their house, they're asleep, it's 2 a.m., they're upstairs, and they hear glass breaking downstairs, the alarm goes off, the dog starts barking, and they know that they're being burglarized, right? You need to call 911 for that. There's not another number, and people, that's what I would do. That's what I think everybody should do. However, as you said in your question, there are so many circumstances that aren't that. Right now, people only have the option of 911, but that's changing, and it's changing fast. So over the last 5 years, over 77 cities have introduced alternative crisis responders. Now, they work differently in different places, but the fundamental idea is that, well, what if you do have somebody, for example, here's a more common 911 call than that. More commonly is somebody sees someone on the corner who's like, they look out of it. Something's off. You're not sure, like, are they strung out? Are they in a mental health crisis? But clearly something is not right. They're not breaking into a house. They're not threatening anybody, but something's wrong. they have built up a network where now in Atlanta, you can call a number, you can call a 311 number, and the message that you're going to get is press 1 if you are calling about an issue of poverty or homelessness or mental health or addiction. So you press 1 and you get directly connected to an operator who is trained in handling those kind of calls. And what they do is they then call the crisis response team that has a commitment to responding as quickly as a police will with 911. And by the way, side note, there's a kind of a myth that when you call 911, the police will get there in 2 or 3 minutes. In a lot of situations, the wait times are much longer than that because they triage themselves, right? If it's someone, if you say there's someone with a gun that's breaking into my house, they're going to come a lot faster than if you say there's somebody on the corner who's strung out. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they respond, but they respond with trained counselors and mental health workers who go then talk to the person and figure out, what do they need? Do they need a detox? Do they need some food? Do they need a place to sleep that night? Now, here's the next step. They have to be adequately funded so that they're available 24 hours a day. And also, here's the other crucial thing. The services that they want to bring people to, the shelter, the drug treatment program, the mental health program, those need to be built up so that you have a crisis responder who arrives and they have some place that they can actually take you. Because the police can always take you to the jail. Like they will always find room at the jail.
You know, this is personal to me. I have 2 family members who are both counselors who work with local police departments in their towns to be those crisis intervention specialists. And to see, and they're both very young, they're twins, to see the ways that they say, to see someone and treat them as a human being, in spite of whatever condition or moment that they are in, how that becomes affirming, that people see the ability to move forward. One of the central factors in creating that kind of ecosystem is the electoral process. And what we're hearing is this framing of the prosecutor versus the felon. At the same time, hearing Vice President Harris be questioned by some because of her past as a prosecutor. What do you wish we would hear in this presidential election cycle when it comes to criminal justice, to reforming this process that we may not get in the sound bites that we're currently hearing? What would you like to hear? What do you think voters need to hear?
When Kamala Harris decided, she tells the origin story of how she decided to become a prosecutor. And she was in California, and that was around the same time I was kind of looking at the same reality, and I chose to become a public defender. And I think that she's in a very, very difficult situation. Right? And you kind of set it up well, but I think we just have to acknowledge it, which is that although crime has declined in this country consistently since late 1990s, 2000s, there was a crime increase during the COVID years. And that moment, the Republican Party kind of refound its traditional voice of, well, we're going to run tough on crime and we're going to blame the Democrats and say that the cities are falling apart. And obviously that's a big part of Trump's message. And so Kamala Harris is in a difficult situation because some of the voters that she has to win over in, these crucial states are susceptible to that kind of messaging. And so she has to be cautious about not looking like she's too soft on crime, if you will. And, I wish this weren't so, but just this is the reality of a presidential election campaign. And at the same time, as you said, there was a pretty vociferous critique of her, from the left on some of the positions that she had taken back when she was, a prosecutor. So she is in a bind, and I really don't think there's an easy out for her. But what I would say, if I were advising her, which I am most decidedly not, but if I were, I think that she should pick issues where you can say, if we take this action, we will reduce incarceration rates and reduce crime at the same time. One of them is actually the one we were just talking about, which is this network of alternative responders. The evidence is quite strong that when you send, and it's kind of obvious, right? If you send someone who's equipped to do the job they need to do, then you're going to get a better outcome than if you send someone who's not equipped to do that job. So if you send a social worker, if you send one of your family members who's trained to do this, they're going to get a better outcome than if you send an officer to do a job that an officer is really not trained to do and doesn't really want to do. A lot of police departments are thrilled about this growth in this network of alternative responders because they're taking some of the work that police don't feel like is core to their mission anyway. But no one else has been set up to do it, so police have had to do it. So that's one area. Another one, actually, we've talked about as well. When we talk about education in prisons, there could be a major national initiative on that front. And the point that you would need to make in pressing this to people is you would put forward the evidence that shows that when you give people these opportunities, crime goes down, right? So you could appeal to people like me who feel that moral sense of obligation to those that we are locking up with our tax dollars. But you could also appeal to people who, maybe are a little bit less moved by that, but you're going to bring them around when you explain to them how this is going to make their neighborhood safer. So I think that there are examples of issues that you could point to where there's a strong research base to suggest that if you do this thing, we'll end up locking up fewer people and have less crime.
In the conclusion of this book, you say that even with all the challenges, you remain hopeful. What keeps you hopeful?
When I was in law school, one of the first speakers that I heard was somebody who I hadn't really heard of at the time. His name is Brian Stevenson. He is obviously now a legend. He came, he had recently moved from Georgia to Alabama. Was setting up a new organization in Alabama that was called the Equal Justice Initiative. It only had a few lawyers. And he talked about one of his early cases. And that early case that he talked about is the case that is the center of his book, Just Mercy, and of the movie, Just Mercy. When he came and he talked about the death penalty, he explained to us that the United States was imposing death sentences on almost 400 people a year. It was concentrated in Texas and Alabama and Virginia, but nationally it was 400 death sentences getting handed down. Now, this wasn't people being executed, but this is people being sentenced to death every year. Last year, 30 years later, 35 people were sentenced to death in this country. Now, 35 is 35 too many, as far as I'm concerned. But we have to look at 400 a year, every year, 400. And through the work of people like Brian and so many others whose names we don't know, but have passionately been advocating to fight the death penalty over the last 30 years through a variety of public education and marches and op-eds and pastors speaking out from the pulpit on Sunday or on whichever day you happen to go to pray in your house of worship. We have changed Americans' belief because at the time, remember, when you stood up against the death penalty in 1995, people said, if we stop executing people, crime is going to skyrocket. Well, in those 30 years since we stopped executing all these people, crime has kept going down. So those claims were wrong. So I look at something like that and I say, well, at the time they told Brian and everybody else, I mean, if you had asked him, and he'll admit this, if you asked him in 1995 whether 30 years later he would have predicted a 90% decline in the death penalty, he would have said, no, that's even, I'm an optimistic person, but no. I think about my parents and their generation as another example of this source of motivation. You know, my dad, he would always talk about this. He would always talk about how the way they portray the history of the civil rights movement now is as if everybody was a part of it, as if everybody was marching, as if everyone was popular. Now, you know this, but most people don't. Martin Luther King was unpopular when he was killed. There was a Gallup poll. He had a 2/3 unfavorable rating. The March on Washington was unpopular when it happened. The March on Washington that is held up now as the greatest example, right, of the civil rights movement was, they polled people before and 60% said they thought the planned march in Washington would hurt the cause of the Negro. That's the way the question was phrased, you know, using the language of the time. When my dad would tell me these stories about how unpopular the civil rights movement was, he would always say, listen, I'm telling you this not because I want credit for having been ahead of my time. That's not the point. He said, I want you to know that we were unpopular and that we were few in number, because the way they tell the history, the way they make it seem like everyone was on the side of civil rights is demoralizing to your generation. Because when you call a meeting around an issue of reforming the criminal system and you only have 10 people there or 15 people there, and half of those people were the planners of the meeting, you want to get demoralized. You look at the civil rights movement and you say, oh, they were thousands and thousands in numbers. And his point was that we didn't start that way. And so I take those messages, right, as sources of hope, because one of my dad's points that he would say over and over again is you cannot let the size of the crowd determine the righteousness of the cause. And so even now when I'm advocating for something here in New Haven or here in Connecticut or in the country that is relatively unpopular, I try to draw inspiration from the fact that there were previous generations, whether it was Bryan Stevenson and the death penalty in the 1990s or my parents in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, who also took on unpopular causes and eventually prevailed.
I appreciate you for reminding us that progress doesn't require popularity. It takes a willing heart and a commitment. And I really want to thank you for all the ways that your commitment shines through to create opportunities for all of us. James Forman Jr. is the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale University. He's the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. He's also co-editor of a new volume, Dismantling Mass Incarceration, a Handbook for Change. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. This episode was also produced by Wayne Edwards. Our intern is Frankie DeVivo. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.